Welcome to episode 140 of the Refuse Fascism podcast. This podcast is brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. Today, we're sharing a year in review, bringing together clips of previous interviews to help make sense of the year that was and prepare for the fight ahead. This is the last episode of 2022. As we look ahead to the new year, our show is committed to helping break people out of the deep freeze that paralyzes those who should be and need to be confronting clear-eyed the storm ahead. We aren't aiming to just air out some good ideas on the show. We aim to broadcast the conversations and analysis necessary to action that could change history at this pivotal moment, and to involve you and a growing audience in those conversations. You'll hear ominous warnings from people who know and understand the stakes for humanity. You'll hear the highlights from deep dives into the most significant issues and firsthand accounts of horror and resistance. Hopefully, some of these clips will inspire you to go back and listen to some of these episodes in full, as well as follow our guests. And while I don't have tidings of comfort and joy for you, we do have a reason to hope for something better, based on the potential that exists for the decent people, the majority of people, to come together with the necessary moral clarity and determination to resolutely refuse fascism. There are insights here that will inspire the courage and confidence that we can do just that, and the means to do so. But before we get into it, we want to thank you for listening. Thank you for being on this journey with us as we engage, dialogue, and debate with a broad array of writers, scholars, legal experts, and people from different walks of life on the roots, nature, and trajectory of fascism in this country. Together, we're working on changing the way people think that prevents them from taking necessary action, helping people to look at uncomfortable truths and act with daring. Together, we are forging understanding and relationships aimed at preventing the consolidation of fascism. This year, we saw a terrible consequence of downplaying and normalizing the fascist threat represented by Donald Trump's rise to power. The Supreme Court, with 3 justices appointed by Trump, overturned Roe v. Wade, plunging 22 million women and girls into a nightmare of female enslavement, second-class citizenship, and forced pregnancy. Earlier this month, the same Supreme Court heard Moore v. Harper, a case that entertains the fascist, quote-unquote, independent state legislator theory that can legalize attempts to overturn the results of the 2024 elections. And these Republic-fascists will not stop. They are aiming for a national abortion ban, attacks on marriage equality and birth control, and the continued demonization of immigrants and LGBTQ people. Now is the time for more vigilance, not less. So to start, let's hear from Sussan Tahmasebi and Jasmin Ramsey about the ongoing uprising in Iran. We're inspired by the bravery and vision of these young people making what yesterday seemed impossible possible, and where still the future is unwritten. Everyone who hates fascism should learn from the example being set through this fierce and unrelenting rebellion, refusing to lower their sights or their heads.
Initially, these protests took shape in demand for justice for Mahsa Jina Amini, a woman who was killed in custody. And they also had, it's sort of a central part of the demand was a demand that had to do about women's rights. So I think in that sense, they're incredibly unique. Initially, the protesters went out calling for justice for Mahsa, an end to all hijab laws, and then also an end to the violent enforcement as well. But of course, we know that those demands have now expanded greatly and have really called for broad-based freedoms and democracy and serious political change and at the highest levels. But initially, they really were centrally focused on women's rights and justice for Massa. And so in that sense, it's very unique that we would have national protests in support of women's rights and, demanding justice for the killing of a woman, because we've never had national protests like that for women before. We've had smaller protests in different cities, but they've never been able to garner this level of support. And I think these protests, in a sense, really are unique because they are so dispersed. They're so decentralized. They don't have one particular leader or even a group of leaders, but they're organized locally. I think every person who participates in them is a leader in their own right. They are national. They have the support of a lot of young people. Women are central to these protests. Even 5 weeks on, they're still very central. Women have participated in the protests in the past, and people have paid attention to women's roles, but we've never seen this level of participation for women. Also, these protests are intersectional. They have men, they have people of different ages, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different ethnicities, different religions. So they're very unique in that sense. And also the protests are creative. So if the university is cracked down upon, which we saw, especially Sharif University, with a lot of violence was used, then somebody else pops up. The high school students began protesting right after that. So it's creative and multifaceted in terms of the strategies that people are using to express their dissent. And it's creative in terms of the creativity that has been born of this protest. So we see a lot of art, a lot of music that's emerged from the protests. So they are very, very different than protests that we've experienced in the past. And I think both the presence of women and the presence of so many young people truly set it aside and make it an extremely unique development in Iranian society. And we see high school students participating very actively in these protests, very peacefully, and they're demanding freedom. They want freedom. That's what they want. And I should say, because you also mentioned the slogan. So the slogan that emerged out of this protest, which has now become international, is a slogan that actually has its history in the Kurdish women's freedom movement, Jen Jian Azadi, that was initially used in the Kurdish areas of Iran, but then quickly translated and it went national. And now we see that it's international. So I think a lot of people can identify with this, and a lot of people around the world can identify with this. It is about ending oppression of women, but also political oppression as well. So it's taken on different dimensions. But a lot of women around the world have identified with these protests because still very central to them is a demand for women's rights and ending oppression against women. And they see themselves in it, that women are dealing with patriarchy, growing fascism that tries to control women's bodies all over the world, whether it's Islamic religious fascism or Christian fascism or nationalist fascism, that we see this emergence of these movements around the world. And very central to all of them is the control of women's bodies, whether it's Latin America or the Middle East or Europe. Very central tenet of these fascist movements are control of women's bodies, women's roles and sexuality, and deciding what constitutes a family. So I think that it struck a chord with a lot of people because they're experiencing similar threats against their rights. Her family was critical in this story, sort of going nationwide, because they had faced a lot of pressure. And from what we hear, they're still facing a lot of threats, but they refused to succumb to that pressure and insisted that Massa's body be taken back home to Saqqez and be buried, not at night as the security forces wanted, but during the day when a lot of people actually participated in the burial. And at that burial, there were protests. Women took off their hijab and they chanted a slogan that said, a death for hijab. How long will we endure this humiliation? And that also really resonated, I think, broadly nationally. And on her grave, they wrote that, Gina, you haven't died, but that your name will become a code word for resistance. And that's really happened. And I think that's also something that resonated. At the same time, the student movement and the women's movement announced protests. Protests happened spontaneously at the burial in Saqqez and other parts of Kurdistan, but then also the women's movement and the student movement also announced protests. Students held protests in universities. The Kurdish political parties, who are largely outside of Iran, they called for a general strike, and it was observed in many Kurdish cities. So I think this culmination, but generally, I think it's just that people are fed up, especially younger women are fed up with the control of their bodies and the violent enforcement of hijab. And there are also many other grievances that have emerged after the first, week that we see very loudly being pronounced in the protests. But I think these are some of the main reasons why these protests became national and why so many people engaged in them. And, they have the participation of so many young people. And I think for those young people, even initially, it went far beyond the hijab. It was about bodily rights and control over their own bodies and bodily integrity.
Mahsa Jina was her Kurdish name. She was from Kurdistan province. She was just a young woman visiting Tehran with her family when she was arrested by the morality police. And the morality police have nothing to do with morality and everything to do with repression. They're basically an arm of the state that polices mainly women, although they can do it to men as well, based on what they wear. And they can arrest and harass people really with impunity. So Mahsa died in state custody. Her family believes that she died because she was beaten and not hospitalized soon enough. And the state went hard against that and said that no, she just passed away from natural causes. And there was no discussion of why she was in state custody in the first place. There has been no independent investigation. Her family has been harassed, as all families of victims of state violence are, and told not to speak about the case. And so this speaks to this kind of crisis of impunity that runs rampant in the Iranian government, where the government is interested in its own survival, and the people have to exist in a society where there is no rule of law. There's only the state and what the state says is okay. And you can either do that or you can suffer. And so I think her story sparked something, as many of these events do in Iran. It sparked something in so many people. One of the chants that we hear is, "Join us or you'll be the next Mahsa." And it's not just women who are very much at the forefront of these protests, but also men that are chanting this. Her story speaks to the experiences of so many people in Iran whose bodies and ways of living, their culture, their language, their religion is policed in such a violent way. And so people have really come out into the streets to call for social and political change at the highest levels of government. Death to the dictator, or death to Khamenei, who's this unelected supreme leader who's been at the highest level of power for decades in Iran. And when Iranians chant that, they're saying that they don't want to live in a dictatorship anymore. They're not calling for reform. They're calling for a new system. And the state really has faced something that it's never seen before, because it's not just in the large liberal cities that typically we've seen. It's also in small towns, conservative places that people are chanting this, even chanting at funerals of people who have been killed in these protests.
Since the beginning of the year, when it was crystal clear that the Supreme Court was intent on decimating the right to abortion, Refuse Fascism helped launch Rise Up for Abortion Rights with the righteous goal of stopping the Supreme Court from overturning Roe. We sounded the alarm and mobilized people to act. We helped people understand what was truly at stake through interviews with lawyers, journalists, and doctors. On this show, we consistently featured the voices of young people who led student walkouts and protests. We brought you to rallies and actions across the country, from Texas to outside the Supreme Court. And we called on you and everyone else to join us. It's worth re-listening in full to many of the episodes we ran on this topic, because too many people are slumbering through this escalating assault on women's lives. The reality that for the first time, a constitutional right has been ripped away and women declared second-class citizens once more is not comprehended by too many putting their heads in the sand, adjusting to the loss of abortion rights nationwide. Too many letting the enslavement of women and girls, plus the whole fascist movement that is going after trans rights and LGBTQ rights and voting rights, be normalized. Too many allowing their sights to be lowered and fury and rage confined to electoral politics. While it matters that measures protecting abortion rights were passed in several states in the midterms, The fascist Supreme Court has the ultimate power to determine whether these measures will stand, and restoring abortion rights for the over 22 million women who have lost them wasn't on the ballot and couldn't have been. This is why we must continue to be in the streets and raise hell. Now you'll hear from Marcela García and Susana Chiarotti on lessons from the Green Wave in Latin America. You'll hear from Sunsara Taylor speaking at a protest in New York City on International Women's Day. Then you'll hear insights from Andrew Seidel and Coco.
It started in Argentina. It's a social movement that began with women advocates flooding the streets, like you said. But these Argentinian women basically drew from experience from an early generation of feminists. I'm not sure how you and your audience are familiar with the history of what happened in Argentina a few decades ago, when there were a lot of kids who were killed by the Argentinian junta. And the mothers of these kids who had been basically kidnapped by the government took to the streets, and they were known and they were famous, and they would use a handkerchief, a white sort of bandana too. And they were known as the mothers of La Plaza de Mayo, because La Plaza de Mayo was where they would congregate and basically demand change and demand answers from the government. Ultimately, this movement became very, very strong through the years, and they got accountability. And it's a really long story, but what I'm trying to say is that there's women now, this generation of women who are fighting for abortion rights, they drew from that experience, and they took a green handkerchief as their symbol, and they took to the streets. And I think one of the most important lessons from Argentina, it created a very strong social movement. And that led to the public opinion needle, if you will, move. And I think that is what basically prompted the change, because you have this younger generation of women. And of course, it's not just the younger generations, it's just basically feminists and women's rights advocates. But it was basically driven by the younger generations. And they took to the streets and they changed public perception around abortion, because the social movement, I think, is very important, the mobilization, the visuals, like you say, to create pressure and ultimately create social change. And I think that worked.
I think that what is happening in the US regarding abortion is a brutal lesson for feminists. That draft ruling, which I hope will be corrected, wants to take us back to medieval times. Mm-hmm. If it were to be approved, it would have a negative influence on the courts of other countries all over the world. So the lesson it teaches us is that our rights never remain final. We must defend them day by day. We cannot take them for granted. Many young women today who were born with this right have no idea of how much it costs to obtain it, nor of the serious consequences of losing it. Clandestine and unsafe abortions, increased maternal mortality, etc. This is because abortion will continue to be performed, whether they are legal or illegal. Behind the judges drafting this sentence, there are powerful and coordinated attempts to roll back hard-won sexual and reproductive rights, not only in Latin America, but around the world. It is not just these judges. There is a whole movement behind it. They have well-funded international networks. They have well-paid lawyers trained by international conservative groups to litigate or lobby against women's rights. And these groups not only outline a detailed agenda to end the constitutional right to abortion in the United States, but continue to confront the advances of women around the world.
It is possible to stop this fascist assault on women. It is possible. But it is not possible by constricting ourselves to choosing between candidates where one half of them are fascist lunatics who sometimes refer to women as host bodies, and the other half are led by a president, Biden, who will not even say the word abortion. We cannot win by accepting defeat in advance. And we have to be honest, this is what way too much of the so-called leaders of the so-called women's movement have done already. They have accepted that Roe v. Wade will fall and abortion rights will be gone. No, this has to stop. Women are not incubators. Women are not property of the state. Women are full human beings. And we have to go out today and going forward, all of us here, and wake up and organize and mobilize the one force that is powerful enough ruffians, relentlessly again and again, filling the streets with their fury, shutting down the campuses and walking out, shutting down the freeways, taking over everywhere again and again, and making clear to the fascists on the court and everywhere else that if they try to take this right away, if they try to slam women backwards, their society will be prevented from functioning at all. And if you want an example of what can be accomplished by people who refuse to accept the unacceptable and who dare to go out and challenge others, look at the women of Colombia. Look at the women of Argentina. Look at the women in Mexico. This is why we wear this green bandana. If you do not know, those are deeply Catholic countries, very repressive states, very patriarchal. Places where abortion has been criminalized for years, women sent to prison for miscarriages. But the women down there went in the streets, not once, but again and again, relentlessly. Sometimes 1 million strong, and they waved this green bandana, and they kept coming back, and they tore down those laws, and they decriminalized abortion. Through their struggle, they made what everybody thought was impossible, possible. And we, as we go out, we will find others who are like us. And as we do, we're going to open up the big questions about what kind of society do we live in that has put these fascist lunatics in power? Where does this desire to control women come from? And what will it take to end it once and for all? And for my part, as a follower of the revolutionary leader Bababakian, who is also the architect of the new communism, I'm going to be fighting for what I understand to be true, which is that all this patriarchy, all this oppression, all these centuries of patriarchal chains are rooted in this system, along with all the other forms of oppression, of capitalism and imperialism. And it cannot be ended without bringing that system down, without overthrowing it once and for all in an actual revolution. But until we do that, all this oppression will regenerate. Just like the villain in one of those misogynist slasher movies that you think is dead at the end, and he comes back, and he comes back. We have to bring this system down. But I also want to say a great strength of this movement is our diversity of views. We don't all agree. We come from different perspectives, but we stand shoulder to shoulder and insisted that women control their own bodies and lives. After today, we're going to organize to bring more people out. April 8th, we're going to spread this green bandana into the workplaces, hospitals, schools, everywhere. It'll be a day of green. And April 9th, we are coming back to this park thousands strong. And across this country, thousands strong. And from there, we are doubling down and doing it again and again until we flood the streets and bring this society to a halt. Because they must not be allowed to shatter the lives of women and slam history backward.
I've been fighting this fight on the front lines. So I was screaming that the overturning of Roe versus Wade was coming for years. And I was kind of surprised by how surprised everybody was, but I do get it. And I think there's a couple things that contributed to this. And one is we hear about these cases as though they are standalone cases, as though they're disconnected from each other and not part of this coordinated top-down push to tear apart the democratic fabric of our secular republic. And they truly, truly are, right? And the Dobbs decision is really a perfect example. Not only does it have its roots in the religious right and where they decided we were going to overturn this rule, it also very clearly violates the separation of church and state. It is imposing one narrow religious doctrine on the entire country through the U.S. Supreme Court. They are saying that life begins at conception, which is just a religious view. That is all it is. And they're imposing that on all of us. And you can actually see this in the language of both of the legislators who passed these laws and even in Sam Alito's majority opinion. You know, he cloaks it and camouflages it by talking about morality, but it doesn't take much to scratch below the surface and see that he's really talking about his religious beliefs.
Well, just one thing I forgot to mention. I think one big lesson that I think has been borne out since the 2020 elections and since 2016 is how polarized and how divided this country is. And there was, I can't remember who wrote it, but someone immediately after the evening or the next day in the New York Times said it's almost like the polarization of the country has become its own check and balance. You don't actually have these other checks and balances anymore. She didn't say all this. I'm expanding. The Supreme Court is gone. But there are these very sharply divided poles. And where that goes is likely to be actually a very dangerous place. And also, is the polarization actually in the interests of the people of the country and the world? In Refuse Fascism, we have the slogan, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. This is something that needs to actually spread as a commitment very quickly among millions of people. The other thing I want to say is the Democrats, if they really cared about the right to legal abortion nationwide, there were so many things they could have done before the fall of Roe. We had a fucking leak that told us what the Supreme Court was going to do. And did the Democrats say all hands on deck, people get in the streets, use your right to nonviolent protest and rise up for abortion rights and stop this from happening, compel the Supreme Court to not overturn Roe because it would threaten the stability of the country? No, they didn't do that. They said, oh, there's nothing you can do. It's already done, this fatalism, and all you can do is vote for Democrats. Why? That's this like thing that they dangle over people's heads. I voted. I'm not telling people to vote or not vote. But if you're relying on the Democrats to give back millions of women and girls the right to abortion, dream on. It's not going to happen. It is sort of mind-boggling that there was actually a movement. There were the beginnings of tens of thousands of people in the streets after the leak and then after Roe was overturned. That is what was needed, this green wave that swept through Latin America and won abortion rights there. Here, everything got channeled back into the midterms. And part of doing that, I think, was this attack on Rise Up for Abortion Rights and Sunsara Taylor and Baba Vakian, this very unprincipled attack that did a lot of damage. Even people who were in the streets then thinking all they can do is vote for Democrats. Yes, it's better to not have Christian fascists in power who are trying to enslave women. But we've said this a lot. Nothing in this country has ever been won by voting alone. Mm-hmm. And the Democrats use this as an issue. They use the fall of Roe to perform better than expected in the midterms. And that is highly cynical and highly, like Paul said, it's a big middle finger to all the women in these red states, including Texas and Florida, who now are being denied miscarriage care. They are all the abortion funds that people thought, maybe not all, but in Texas, everything in this area that people thought was going to be the answer, they are not funding abortion. Okay, so all this money that people poured into that and then being chained to these normal channels that are being eviscerated, it's making life hell for women and girls all over this country. I have to say that I'm pretty pissed off at the Democrats and the women's movement aligned with the Democrats for taking that strategy. Also, not to mention that they've actually funded some of these fascist candidates, thinking it'll give their candidates a better chance to win. This is highly irresponsible and risky, but I don't see any reaction. I don't actually know what the plan is. It doesn't seem like there is a plan. And once again, people are being led to make peace with the fascism that is driving these attacks on abortion.
The Christian fascist movement in this country is inextricably linked to the battle over abortion. And for many years, the common wisdom was this was their obsessive, quote unquote, single issue, a framing which, by the way, helped minimize the importance of abortion rights in the public consciousness. But this was never true, and the Christian fascist vision for subjugating half of humanity into nothing more than a living death is only one element of the nightmare they are trying to impose on humanity. This year, they came out swinging as not only a big voting bloc and organizing force for the fascists, but with an unprecedented number of open theocrats, dominionists, and unhinged end-times evangelists as leaders of the broader fascist movement, and even candidates on the GOP slate. Just this past year, we spoke with Sarah Posner, Catherine Joyce, Philip Gorski, Annika Brockschmidt, Thomas Lecoq, Bradley Onishi, Samuel Perry, Andrew Seidel, and Thomas Zimmer to help us understand the Christian fascist threat. Here, you'll hear clips from our conversations with Onishi, Perry, Seidel, and Zimmer, in that order.
There's this character on The Simpsons, Ned Flanders, who's the annoying neighbor up the street. And Ned Flanders is the Christian who goes to church every week and goes to Bible study on Wednesday night. And he's always telling Homer Simpson not to drink as much beer and don't use cuss words. And he's always like kind of that irritating moralist, like the guy that you don't really like, but you're not afraid of because he's just that good old hokey sandal wearing, cargo shorts wearing neighbor up the street who, you know, wants you to come meet Jesus someday. And all right. That is the common image of white Christians in the country. That is the benefit of the doubt they've been given. The benefit of the doubt they've been given is you are the pesky moralists who are always trying to get us to come back to Jesus. We're not scared. You're not fascists. You're not insurrectionists. I mean, you're annoying, but you're not the person who's going to ruin the country. In fact, yeah, it'd probably be good if I drank less beer, and it'd probably be good if I didn't use cuss words in front of my kids as much. That's probably a good idea. Yeah, okay. Now, there's another character in the Simpsons who's Mr. Burns, and Mr. Burns is this sort of, you know, authoritarian owner of the nuclear power plant, and he's always scheming to take more and more power. And there's nothing good about Mr. Burns when you watch the show. He's evil and he's cunning and he's really cruel. My argument is that we didn't see this coming because we have treated white Christians in the country like Ned Flanders when they have been giving us the cues all along that they're more akin to Mr. Burns, that their number one goal is power. And they don't care if that means exclusion. They don't care if that means taking rights away from people. They don't care if that means not extending rights to people. They don't care if that means being anti-democratic. That kind of talk has been going on for decades if we just listened. But the lens is, no, you're just a Christian. I mean, you're church-going, Bible-holding, irritatingly moral kind of guy. You're not the fascist up the street. You're not the extremist up the street. Your church is not the place where people get radicalized. No, that's not what happens there. You're a small business owner. You own the shop up the street. You're the dad who coaches the baseball. You're the mom who's on the PTA board. And all of the fears and all of the ludicrous kind of paranoia that was cast upon Muslims in this country in the aughts, the 2005s and 6s and 8s, all of the ways that supposedly Sharia law and extremist forms of Islam were supposedly infecting the country and all this. None of that kind of lens was ever conjured when Christian extremists actually acted in ways that were overwhelmingly deleterious to our democracy. The Tea Party, if you read Ruth Bronstein, the sociologist, was an overwhelmingly Christian fundamentalist movement, even though they said on the surface, we're libertarians, we're just against taxes. Dig into the data, dig into the respondents and what they said. Going back to when we had a black president in the Oval, the Tea Party formed very quickly and very adamantly, very vehemently. This is the era of the whole goal is just to shut down the country until we get our power back.
But we see white Christian nationalism emerge basically in times of heightened racial and cultural conflict. When the question gets asked, who is this nation for? And who deserves to have power in this nation? Usually some form of white Christian nationalism starts to appear. In the early 1800s, it starts to appear again around the time of the Civil War. And after World War II, and obviously there's this continuity, there's this thread that white Christian nationalism always around, but again, it starts to get activated and to reemerge as a dominant force. Again, after World War II, Eisenhower and Billy Graham, because anti-communists push who is this nation for? And what are we as Americans? Well, we are defining ourselves as Christian, middle-class capitalist, Christian up against those godless communists. And this is where Kevin Cruz's brilliant work starts to pick up the thread. Then we see it emerge again after the civil rights movement and after Roe versus Wade and really during the moral majority, right? Like, who is this nation for? Well, it's for good, moral, white Christian citizens like us. That just keeps on reemerging. And so white Christian nationalism is an ideology. It is also a political strategy. This is where we can start talking about how people who don't necessarily believe in white Christian nationalism can use white Christian nationalism. So, for example, Donald Trump. I don't think Donald Trump believes anything. Like, I wouldn't define Donald Trump as a Christian nationalist in the sense that he deep down believes this country belongs to like evangelical Christians who subscribe to certain theological, Donald Trump doesn't believe any of that. That's for suckers. That's the stuff that Donald Trump used. But he is able to leverage Christian nationalist language in order to build a base, to activate a base of really angry and scared people who feel like this country is being taken from them and want to get it back. So white Christian nationalism in that sense is both an ideology that mobilizes an audience, but it's also a political strategy that can be used to activate people. And it can be leveraged by actors who really just don't care either way. They just know they need to make a base very scared and angry.
Oftentimes people say, well, but isn't freedom of religion important? Isn't that such a cornerstone of the society? How is what they're going for different than those who advocate or promote religious freedom?
It's such an important question because when I say they are weaponizing religious freedom, I really do mean just that. They are litigating the legal meaning of religious freedom as a constitutional right in case after case. And in the process, they are redefining that protection. They're perverting its meaning. The Crusaders' religious freedom cases, and I'm doing air quotes there for all the listeners who can't see, their religious freedom challenges are superficially about Christian crosses and veterans, or playgrounds and skinned knees, or private school vouchers, or bakeries and gay weddings, or coaches that just want to pray. But really, they are about privilege and supremacy, literally about privileging the right, air quotes again, kind of conservative Christian over everyone else. Their goal is to use religious freedom to elevate conservative Christianity above the law. And I think that legal questions of religious freedom, when religion and the law collide, I actually don't think they are that hard for us to sort out. In fact, I think they're pretty easy. Sometimes I think religious freedom questions can be emotionally fraught, especially if they involve children's. But as part of the crusade, the Crusaders have misled and confused deliberately so many Americans about where we draw the legal lines for this founding American principle. So I really do think that these religious freedom cases, they may not be the simplest questions, but they're not very hard either. And historically and legally, we draw three basic lines, and I go over those lines in the book. And they're really, really simple. And the first is that we distinguish between action and belief. Your right to believe is absolute. Your right to act on that belief is not. So I open up American Crusade with several stories about drivers letting Jesus take the wheel. Literally doing that. Now, they are free to believe that Jesus will drive, but the civil law can step in very clearly and say, no, you can't do that. That's reckless. We can fine you. We can take away your license. If you hurt somebody, you might be going to jail. So your belief is unlimited, but action is limited, which brings us to the second line. Okay, well, if it's okay for the government to step in, when is it okay? And the answer here is actually pretty simple too. It's where the rights of other people begin. Just as your right to swing your fist ends at the other person's nose, your right to exercise your religion ends where the rights of others begin. Religion has never been, ever in the history of this country, a license to harm others or infringe their rights in any way. And it is that line that we are seeing completely perverted and turned on its head. And we are seeing these crusaders argue, not only is my right to exercise my religion absolute, violating line number one, but I can also harm other people or violate their rights when I'm exercising my religion. And then the third line is the separation of church and state, which is also pretty easy. The short version is our government has no religion to exercise, and government officials can't abuse government power and resources to promote their personal religion. So in the book, I lay out these three lines, and then I show how the court has warped not just the lines in the law, but also facts and reality to help rewrite those lines in the last decade or so.
So he explicitly says, look, I think over 50% of the electorate should not even be considered American, right? I don't think you need to know much about history to understand how radical and how dangerous that sort of rhetoric and that sort of thinking is, because once you start excluding people from the body politic, I mean, look, what's the next step? That basically means you also forfeit all the rights and all the protections that come with being an accepted member of the body politic. But that's where they are. They're openly anti-democratic. They're very blatant in their sort of disdain for democracy. And more than that, they are very clearly sort of saying we are the minority. They're not claiming to be the numerical majority, right? There's a big shift here from even a few decades ago when these sort of conservative intellectuals would usually claim to be speaking for a moral majority or a silent majority, right? They're not doing that anymore. They are acknowledging more people voted for Joe Biden, but that's exactly what makes them sort of more aggressive, not less aggressive, right? They're not willing to grapple with the fact that, oh, okay, so maybe we have to either moderate or we have to sort of find a consensus. No, nothing. They're basically saying, look, numbers don't matter. We are the only proponents of quote unquote real America, again, by which they mean a white Christian patriarchal understanding of America. And so we have a right to rule and to dominate in this country. And so basically what they say is, if democracy doesn't grant us that right anymore, then democracy has to go. And the people who vote for democracy, or for the Democrats specifically, they have to go too. Their vote doesn't count. It doesn't matter. It's a radically anti-democratic, it's a radically anti-pluralistic vision. And again, it's radicalizing precisely because they acknowledge that they've lost the 2020 election. I think what we always need to ask ourselves is, how are they justifying the radically anti-democratic agenda that they are sort of propagating? And they're justifying it by basically creating this supposedly radical leftist threat that is out to destroy the country. And so if you are the sole defender of real America, if you are the sole proponent of real America, which they claim to be, right, then you have every right to defend America by whatever means. And that's basically sort of where these people are. And I think what is really interesting is how openly and how blatant they are with that diagnosis, which is something that has shifted over the past few years. Those anti-democratic tendencies and impulses, they have been there for a long, long time. That's not new. But the radicalism and the openness with which that is now put out there by these reactionary intellectuals is very, I mean, I can say interesting, but it's honestly frightening is what it is.
Thomas offers the perfect segue into our next major topic, because what happens when a hyped up, violent movement on a mission from God believes they are the only true people of this land? Well, it might flow from that to, say, storming the Capitol building to keep your dear leader in power. We focused on this a lot this past year, not only to understand what happened on January 6, 2021, but to recognize its importance and the importance of its afterlife, to appreciate how it continues to shape the political terrain today. We discuss in depth this day that many want to move past, because the decent people in this country must be polarized not against some imaginary buffoons or the illusion of slightly unreasonable Republicans, but the reality of a violent, legitimized fascist movement that came within a hair's breadth of overturning an election, potentially kicking all the fascist violence that has come down these past 6 years into overdrive. And they have only strengthened their resolve and developed their strategies since that fateful day. So now, listen to insights from Wajahat Ali, Bradley Onishi, Danielle Moodie, Paul Street, and Rachael Wachstein, in that order. Rachael speaks about how the Highland Park shooter Cremo wasn't a lone wolf, in addition to discussing Trump's coup.
We were talking about that you thought you might have scared your fellow panelists earlier today.
Yeah, so I was on Mary Trump's podcast, The Great Mary Trump, and she's invited a few of us to give commentary during and after these fantastic hearings that I hope people have seen, or at the very least, you've caught up on them later on the YouTubes or the news channels. And specifically, she asked me about my assessment about, well, what does it say about the Republican Party that even if they throw Donald Trump under the bus after these hearings, that many of them, even the people that we've heard from, such as Rusty Bowers and Brad Raffensperger, have said, oh yeah, even though Trump pressured us to do illegal acts in his illegal coup, and the MAGA base has literally threatened us and our family, we'll still vote for him again. And what I said, my conclusion was that the GOP and the entire right-wing ecosystem has become a radicalized and weaponized force that is against the majority and against democracy. They will try to implement white Christian nationalism and gain power for the minority by any means necessary. They will take back this country with violence if they must, and they will stand their ground because they believe the rest of us, including Republicans who don't go along with a big lie, are an active threat to them, their religion, their lifestyle, and now now their children. Specifically, they believe we're part of an international cabal led by the Jews who are trying to both replace them and also kidnap and eat and kill their children. And I'm not making that up. That's part and parcel of QAnon. And as evidence of that, and I said a lot, is that 108 Republicans who've just won their primary since May all believe the big lie. Majority of Republican voters believe the big lie. The RNC, ladies and gentlemen, not just Marjorie Taylor Greene, the RNC itself decided to censure Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger for appearing on this bipartisan committee. Liz Cheney used to be the number 3 Republican, ladies and gentlemen. But that same day where they censured Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who voted with Trump 93% of the time, but said, you know what, a violent insurrection is a step too far. They said the violent insurrectionists, the RNC said this, the violent insurrectionists were, quote, ordinary citizens engaging in a, quote, legitimate political discourse. The RNC said this. And what we're witnessing right now is the Republican Party is purging itself of everyone who's not extreme enough. Mo Brooks, a freaking extremist who wore a Kevlar vest on the day of January 6th, and according to the hearings, apparently asked for a pardon. He's kicked out. Why? Because he eventually said, we should move on from the election. Dan Crenshaw is now called Eye Patch McCain and a traitor. He is freaking hard far-right Texas Republican, accosted just last week by the Texas GOP because he says we got to move on. The Texas GOP itself is saying, hey guys, in 2023, we reserve the right to secede. And by the way, the Texas GOP, the Republicans, the second most populous state, have said that they affirm the big lie and Joe Biden is not the legitimate president. So even if the hearings win, what I see right now, Sam, is that the institutions barely held, and all it would have taken was a few more Republicans who are, say, in the Justice Department, who are already in the Supreme Court, who are already packing the state legislatures to go along with this ongoing coup, and boom, that's a wrap. That's it. All it takes is a few. And the next time they get power, which seems like likely in 2022 and 2024, they'll have the House, they'll have the Senate, they have the Supreme Court, they have the state legislatures, they're unleashing the precinct strategy, they'll have the Justice Department, and the coup will be a success. Who or what will stop them? And if I'm wrong here, tell me where I'm wrong. I'd love to be proven wrong. That's what I said.
Ali Mistel, who I respect and many people do and should, put something out that I just wanted to get your opinion on. He tweeted earlier today that people need to understand that one of the only things keeping conservatives, I don't like that word, but he used it, in line 20 years ago was the concern of political revolt if their decisions were too extreme. Now they don't fear that at all. They think the opposition is too weak. They're going to keep doing this. Arguably, the conservative justices are more concerned over their personal safety, random act of violence directed at them by a crazy person, than they are of a concerted political pushback by a dedicated opposition. They don't think the quote unquote will of the people can stop them. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that? And how should we change that?
No, I absolutely agree. You've seen an emboldened Alito Thomas Court, with these decisions as today's recording, where apparently you don't need Miranda rights anymore. Awesome. So police can do whatever they want. And apparently they went after blue states who decided, such as New York, that, hey, maybe we'll limit concealed carry. They're like, nope, Constitution says you can't do that. So they're flexing to the hilt because they're like, who's going to stop us? We're running out of time. We're under attack from Antifa and the deep state. We have to save our country. We have to save our children from becoming atheist transgender activists. We're going to do exactly what we want to do. We have the majority. What are you going to do? F you. It's like the woman who's running for Arizona governor tweeted yesterday. She said that if you elect me governor, I'm not going to even implement these unconstitutional gun laws. And then she just straight up threatened. What's the Fed going to do? Come and arrest me? I'd like to see you try. I call your bluff. Boom. There you go. A beautiful snapshot of the mindset that we're going to do what we have to do to save our country. You're too weak to stop us. Even if you think you're going to stop us, we're going to call your bluff. We know you're not man enough to do it. You're going to bring a pencil to a knife fight. We're going to bring a mother effing AR-15. We got the courts. We got the state legislatures. We got the House, probably in 2023. We got the Senate. We got the presidency. And this is how you also mobilize a vigilante mob. This is how you get Kyle Rittenhouse's. This country belongs to me. I'm going to stand my ground. I'm going to take a gun. I'm going to shoot whoever I want. What are you going to do about it? Nothing. Look what they did to Kyle Rittenhouse. Nothing. Look what they did to Eddie Gallagher, the Navy SEAL war criminal. Pardon him. Look what they did to Mark McCloskey, who took out a gun against peaceful BLM protester. Pardon him, and now he's running for Senate. It's my country now. It goes back to the 40s and 50s, right? In the South, all part of the KKK. We're going to implement frontier justice. And what are you going to do to stop us? And they're right. What are we going to do to stop them? So far, it seems nothing. And so if people are overwhelmed, exhausted, trying to survive, becoming climate change refugees, gas prices are going up, they'll feel drained and they'll feel tapped out. That's what they expect us to do. They expect us to first and foremost be intimidated by a minority, to cede the ground. It's working in school boards, where then they step in and take over. And they're expecting us to be too exhausted and too confused with disinformation. However, I'll say this. My friend said after George Floyd's murder, same thing like I just said right now. People don't care. People are overwhelmed. People are exhausted. And I said, sometimes all it takes is one spark. It takes one moment to galvanize the majority. And 23 million people came out. I still believe that when enough women realize that Roe v. Wade is gone and the Supreme Court keeps on it, being extreme as it is, and perhaps even overturns Griswold and Eisenstein. For those of you who don't know, that's the right to privacy, the right to birth control. They've said they want to go after it. Loving v. Virginia, the allowed interracial marriage. My thing is and some Republicans realize this, we're going too extreme too fast. And some Republicans are like, whoa, let's slow the roll of our fascist plot. But at the end of the day, it'll be up to the people in the streets, the people within these institutions fighting back, the people within these corporations saying enough is enough. Because without the people, I do not have faith in the institutions anymore. And I do not have faith in the Democratic Party that unfortunately is too weak and has the wrong type of leadership for this type of fight.
There are plenty of people who are Christian, whose faith moves them to be part of fighting for justice, of expanding who has rights and who has freedom to feed the hungry, to do what they believe they are doing, and they're moved to do that good by their faith. And what we're talking about is something different. I agree very wholeheartedly with Brad, with what he's saying about the cover that it gives the white nationalists. I also think that the Christianity is not a joke, and that there are many people who have for some time been taking the Bible literally. And we should see that for all the horror that it is. It is a doctrine, if you take it literally, of pro-slavery, a doctrine of pro-rape, just the most patriarchal doctrine you can find.
No, I think you're exactly right. I'll give you one example of this. The night before the J6 insurrection, there was a Jericho march, which was supposed to be this big prayer rally for supporters of President Trump. And there had been many, quote unquote, Jericho marches going on in the month before this. But what were they doing? Well, they were referencing the story of Jericho, where the Israelites march around Jericho and eventually the walls fall down because God miraculously does that. And then they're able to take Jericho and part of the promised land that God had promised them. Now, there are many ways that Christians and Jews have read that text over the years to try to confront what seems to be attempted genocide and the violence there. There are many communities that have said, we need to confront this. We need to see the complexity involved. We can't read this literally, because if we do, it's going to lead us here. And yet, if you have a group of people who have a Jericho march and they read the Bible literally the day before J6, what happens in that story? Yeah, the walls fall down, and then they go and annihilate every man, woman, child, and animal they can find. And it starts to kick in. Oh, and they're not just praying for a miracle. They're praying for a miracle that will allow them to do what happened and all of a sudden the wheels start turning and you're like, holy moly, the literal reading of the Bible you're talking about leads to real world violence in ways that are horrifying.
Donald Trump needs to be in jail, as does everyone that was involved in the 1/6 insurrection, not because I think that it's going to stop Trumpism, but because it needs to send a signal to the millions that are coming in their stead that we are not accepting this in this country and that we will fight back against this rhetoric, against this hate. But if you do nothing, then that is akin to providing a pardon for Donald Trump and Trumpism and clearing the way for who comes next, which will in fact be worse.
Well, let me give a shout out to Tony's point that he just made about the importance of prosecuting Trump. It's not clear that the GOP, which is now a fascist party, has a replacement. I'm not sure that DeSantis or Abbott or God knows who has that kind of background in whatever that weird charisma this orange lunatic has with his base. We're going to find out perhaps whether that can be replicated. It's very important that this guy be put away, at the very least disqualified from running again. I've been wondering for a while, where's the mass movement to demand the prosecution of this guy? When are crowds going to show up outside the Department of Justice and demand that Garland move on this? I guess the main myths that I just want to reinforce that we really need to gut check and question people on are this American exceptionalist notion that it can't happen here. The myth that I know personally a lot of people engage in, that you can ignore politics, that you can just sort of not pay attention to them and sort of live in a privatized world where all that crazy stuff out there is just something I really don't need to pay attention to. When you're in the audience, when you're in the crowd, just watching the game, if that even, of course, a lot of people aren't even watching, right? The game has a way of jumping up off of the field and impacting your life in really, really horrible ways. And the abortion decision, which caught a lot of people more by surprise than they should have been caught, is a really classic case of that. And that's a case where the game has really jumped out and is starting to have a direct impact on young people's lives.
You know, the thing is that when something like this happens, and it does happen a lot, it really does feel like it couldn't happen in your town or it couldn't happen to you. But after this happened and I started talking online about my experiences with the shooter and sharing the articles from the time that came out in the Chicago Tribune and a variety of other media outlets. You know, when I started publishing what I knew and then reposting newspaper articles that had the shooter standing next to other young men who were more aggressive than him, people from all over the country started messaging me and telling me their stories, their militias, their ordeal with Proud Boys members and all kinds of far-right activity in their community. And they were all scared. And so I guess one of the messages I want to get out there is that Crimo, or the shooter, is not a lone wolf. He may have acted alone. He may not have even told anyone exactly what he was going to do, but he and these guys who are still in our community are being radicalized in similar ways. They're participating in neo-Nazi online groups. They're fetishizing Nazism. They're encouraging each other. They get a signal from the White House to stand back and stand by. They're invited in to the Capitol to overturn democracy, and they are encouraged to bring weapons. I mean, this is something that is growing in America. The prime example of how what's going on nationally and with the committee hearings and all of that, to me, I flash back to when Trump was at the debate with Biden and said to the Proud Boys, when asked to disavow them, stand back and stand by. And we've heard at the hearings that drove up the membership. We felt that in our local area. We all of a sudden had people who were members of the Proud Boys showing up at Stop the Steal rallies that we were counter protesting. When it's on a national stage like that, and it's made to seem like it's okay or it's normal or it's politics as usual, people act accordingly. And the longer that Trump and all of the others who were actively involved in the insurrection, until they're held accountable, it's a free-for-all. So this, unfortunately, is not the first time that people have acted like this in history when faced with fascism. We know for a fact that German Jewry was highly educated. They were people of means. They were in Germany for hundreds of years. They were participating as soldiers in World War I. And there were many who saw what was happening and brown shirts in the street and all of that. And that didn't happen overnight. That built up over 10 years. And there were people who saw it, and if they could, they got out. But there were a lot of people who didn't, because they could not believe that things could go that badly. And who could have believed that at that time there wasn't really any precedent in history, but we have a precedent. We have museums to the precedent. We are raised on the slogan, never again. And here we are.
Despite the damning evidence against him presented in the January 6th hearings and their commission report, Trump has been free to hold his hate rallies and announce his candidacy for president. Whether he wins the nomination or not, he has transformed and hardened the Republican Fascist Party and political base, fomenting and relying on xenophobic nationalism, racism, misogyny, and the aggressive reinstitution of oppressive, quote-unquote, traditional values. Election workers get death threats. School boards ban books. Truth is obliterated. Threats of violence, including talk of civil war, is a key part of the fascist advance. As we talk about frequently on this show, once in power, fascism's defining feature is the essential elimination of the rule of law and democratic and civil rights. This year, we spoke with people on all kinds of frontline battles against fascism. People who refuse to hide away, who refuse to even just say, not in my neighborhood, but who recognized the fascist threat for what it was and said, no, fuck no, we won't accept their future, inspiring and organizing others to join them. In addition to the folks You've heard from already organizers with Rise Up for abortion rights. We spoke with student organizers against the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, trans rights activists in Texas, drag performers, drag storytime defenders, people who organized against the fascist Canadian trucker convoys, and anti-war activists. We know you take seriously the threat posed by this vicious, revenge-fueled fascism and the real possibility of a Trumpist GOP reseizing the White House. We also know that you recognize that we cannot sit back and let this movement grow in strength and power. Ignoring or misunderstanding this threat further imperils the lives of millions of people in this country and billions all over the world. So too does relying on the Democratic Party to resolve this nightmare. Even after threats and acts of violence being targeted as enemies, deemed traitors, the Democratic Party consistently conciliates and tries to collaborate with Republican fascists. Trump and his fascist movement have torn up the norms, thrown out the rulebook, yet the outrage and hopes of people on the side of justice keeps getting diverted into the very channels that are being eviscerated and away from the kind of deep, mass, society-wide struggle that is needed. It's why I hope that you'll help us change that dynamic, moving people from passivity and accommodation into active, visible refusal. You can do that a lot of ways. Listening to the show, talking about the show, following and subscribing to the show, rating and reviewing to help this show reach more people, talking about it in person and on social media. And yeah, chipping in to support this show and help us reach more listeners. So with that, we're bringing you next Danielle Moodie on resistance and Henry Giroux on the connection between critical thinking and refusing fascism.
I want people to be activated to push these members off of their perch of complacency. And I think that the more people that demand action, the better. Just recently, Sri Lanka, of the tens of thousands of people that rushed the government and said, like, we're done. Right? Like, we're done with this. You all need to get the hell out of this country, flee to the Maldives. Like, we're done. And I'm just like, when are American citizens going to do the same and be like, so we're actually done with working. We're done with keeping our head down and thinking that all of this is going to get better. We're living in multiple pandemics at one time. The earth is literally on fire. You got Republicans trying to take control of this country and bring it back to what they believe to be its white nationalist core. And then you have Democrats going around talking about, well, we cut prescription drug prices. And I'm like, what the fuck? I feel crazy. While I'm happy that you're doing that, okay, but I also need you to acknowledge that these people are trying to kill us, right? In no uncertain terms. Like, I'm not being hyperbolic. Like, they literally are trying to kill us and are saying so in no uncertain terms. And so at some point, you need to brace what is instead of, like you had said earlier, trying so desperately to hold on to what was. What was is dead. What was is gone. It is never coming back. Whatever machination of America is for us in the future will look nothing like what it was in the earlier parts of the 2000s and backwards. If you can't come to that reality, that place, then how can you build out strategy to combat the issues that we have if you're still living in the fantasy of who we were?
And so what we're talking about here is a collapse of consciousness that's at the basis for the collapse of political agency, individually and collectively. And without the foundation for critical agency, which is an informed public, a critical public, a public that learns how to govern rather than be governed, you have the foundation for fascism. Fascism is rooted in a kind of anti-intellectualism that's a lot smarter than simply saying somebody's stupid. That personalizes the problem. It's about an ignorance that's manufactured. It's about a culture that's no longer able to question itself. It's about a culture that aligns itself with strong men, and I use that word, the masculine version, very purposely, with strong men who basically have all the answers, strong men who hate women, strong men who basically are waging a war on young people, strong men who hate the other, strong men who really believe that white replacement theory is true, that they are the victims, that the public should only be occupied by basically the purification of what we would call racial blood. But what DeSantis is doing that's very smart is he's destroying the institutions that would make it possible for people to learn how to hold power accountable. And he knows that. He knows it plays well. He knows that mass ignorance has a certain currency in an enormously anti-intellectual culture that's been weaponized. Anti-intellectualism has been weaponized. It's no longer just an attribute. It's a weapon of political power. And I think that he's done a number of things. He starts with the school with the banning of books. He starts with terrorizing teachers by claiming that they could be fired if they teach certain things. He's eliminated tenure, done everything he can to eliminate tenure in higher education. He uses the language of McCarthyism. He terrorizes LGBTQ students because he knows they're relatively powerless as a bloc, and it goes on and on. So it seems to me that he has basically brought together two things. A political strategy he sees as having enormous valence among his base, preparing himself for the elections for 2024. Secondly, he knows that the institutions that threaten him the most are those that basically are involved in the form of criticism that could expose how empty he is, how fascistic he is, how right-wing he is, and what the consequences could be. He has completely shut off, increasingly, not just the schools, which are a laboratory for fascism, but he's shut off. He's now moved to any institution that would take critical thinking seriously and holding power accountable seriously. When you read that history, what jumps out at you are the parallels, which are basically mind-blowing. First of all, the book burning, the attack on universities, the anti-intellectualism, the attempt by Hitler and Goebbels, who make the claim that youth have to be conquered. We have to make sure they never think again. The claim to ultranationalism and racial purification. Nothing can exist in the curriculum which is un-German. The firing, first of all Jewish professors, then the firing of anybody who disagreed, the intervention into the curriculum, the rewriting of history, the claim that it could only be patriotic German history, the ongoing attempt to create organizations outside of the schools that reinforce the schools, the urging of students and other faculty in both the high schools and in higher education to basically spy on each other, the signing of loyalty oaths. You can't ignore this stuff, and you can't ignore the larger project, which is really fundamental, in which it took place. These are not simply ad hoc policies that happened to come out of nowhere. They were systemic. They wanted to build institutions that produced a consciousness of utter conformity, loyalty, and racial superiority. And I think that what strikes me the most about that curriculum and what strikes me the most about those educational policies is not just the attempt to make people ignorant, but the racial cleansing, the white supremacy. At the heart of this curriculum was white supremacy and racial cleansing. Ask yourself, what is going on in the schools today that suggests the same thing? It's impossible. It's impossible to separate these policies in the United States from white supremacy. It's impossible. The call for vouchers, the call for getting rid of government schools, the claim that teachers are pedophiles who believe in anything critical, the claim that basically you have to eliminate from the universities and from high schools, any elementary schools, any teacher who basically is willing to hold power accountable. I mean, this is about creating a systemic formative culture that ensures that fascism will thrive in those institutions that threaten it most. The first casualty of authoritarianism are the minds that would oppose it. And fascism begins with language. It begins with the language of dehumanization. It moves to the language of exclusion. It embodies the language of racial cleansing, and it moves then into camps. And the camp is a metaphor. It's a metaphor, not simply for genocide. It's a metaphor for developing what I would call a politics of disposability in which the punishing state overrides the social state. And all problems now that you disagree with are criminalized, i.e., for instance, Ron DeSantis passes a law in Florida that says if protesters are too close to certain areas, particularly in white suburban neighborhoods, people have the right to run them over, literally run them over. They passed the law.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. We, as always, want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, art, ideas for topics or guests, or lend a skill. Tweet me at Sam B. Goldman. See the link for our Mastodon in the show notes. Drop me a line at samanthagoldman at refusefascism.org. Leave us a message. Go to anchor.fm/refuse-fascism and click that message button. If you want to support the show, amazing. It's simple. Show us some love by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice. And of course, follow, subscribe so you never miss an episode. The only force that can actually stop the consolidation of fascism is you, the people, guided and inspired by a love for all of humanity to wrench the future away from these fascists. So start 2023 off right by making a gift to the show, making a gift to refuse fascism. Pledge your continued determination to stop an American fascism that imperils people all over the globe and the earth itself. Chip in to support our pod and content creation to help people understand and act to stop the fascist threat. It's super easy to do. Donate by visiting refusefascism.org and hitting the donate button. When you're there, you'll find info on how to make a tax-deductible donation, as well as other ways to give. Check out the show notes for a link. Thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkleman for helping produce this episode. I know, it was a lot. Thanks to incredible volunteers. We have transcripts available for each episode. So be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get episodes in your inbox each week. We'll be back next year. That's next Sunday. Until then, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.